If you had told me a year ago that a rusty old cabin and a modest savings account would change my entire life, I would have laughed in your face. But here I am. My name's Claire Donovan, and this is the story of how a forgotten little house on Lake Willow saved me and exposed the ugly truth about the people I once called family. Growing up, I was always the other daughter, the one nobody brags about. My sister, Sabrina, was the golden child. Straight A student, champion swimmer, piano prodigy, the whole sparkly package. Me? I tripped over my own feet in gym class and barely scraped through algebra. I loved sketching and reading fantasy novels, which earned me exactly zero attention in a house obsessed with trophies. Every family dinner, every holiday, every single conversation. It was always about Sabrina, where Sabrina was going to college, what Sabrina wanted for Christmas, how proud everyone was of Sabrina's new internship. If I said something, at best, I got a polite nod. At worst, I was told to stop being dramatic. Eventually, I just stopped trying. It felt easier to disappear into the background than to keep fighting for a seat at a table where I was barely tolerated. The only place I ever felt seen was at my grandparents' cottage by the lake. Grandma June and Grandpa Walter, they weren't perfect, but to me, they were home. Whenever I visited, Grandma would brew this ridiculously sweet peach tea and insist I tell her everything. Even if it was just about the weird science project we did at school, Grandpa would act like my terrible doodles were priceless art, pinning them to the fridge with a proud little smile. There, I wasn't the disappointing daughter, I was just Claire. And that was enough. I still remember the smell of the place. Fresh cookies, old books, and the sharp, clean scent of the lake blowing through open windows. Their cottage wasn't fancy, but it felt like magic. Like breathing fresh air after being underwater too long. If something bad happened at home or school, I'd bike to their house like my life depended on it. The second I stepped onto their creaky porch, it was like the whole world shifted a little more in my favor. As I got older, the visits became fewer. College applications, part-time jobs, life. But even when I wasn't there, I carried that house, and the unconditional love that filled it tucked safely inside my heart. I knew I didn't belong in my parents' world. But somehow, I still believed that maybe, if I just worked hard enough, they'd finally be proud of me. Spoiler alert, they weren't. When I announced I wanted to go to art school, my parents laughed. "You'll never make a living doodling," Dad said, shaking his head like I'd just told him I wanted to join a traveling circus. Mom barely looked up from her phone. "Be practical, Claire. We can't waste money on some silly hobby." Meanwhile, they were blowing through tens of thousands of dollars planning Sabrina's wedding, a massive, glittering event in a historic downtown hotel with custom flower walls, imported wine, and a live band. The kicker? When I asked about a small loan for tuition, they said, "There's nothing left. We have to prioritize." Prioritize. Right. I took out student loans, worked 2 jobs, sketched portraits at farmers markets on weekends just to pay for my supplies. Not because I thought it would win them over anymore, but because it was the only dream that was actually mine. Still, I swallowed the hurt, smiled through gritted teeth at Sabrina's endless bridal showers and engagement parties, pretending it didn't sting every time someone said, "Oh, you're the artsy one, right?" Like I was some quaint little side attraction. At Sabrina's wedding, my grandparents were there, looking more frail than I remembered. Grandma squeezed my hand tight at the reception, her eyes shining. "You're doing great, sweetheart," she whispered. "Don't let anyone make you small." I blinked back tears, nodding. Because in that moment, even surrounded by champagne fountains and crystal chandeliers, the only thing that mattered was her voice telling me I was enough. Grandpa Walter chimed in with a sly grin. "And if you ever need anything, you know where to find us." I didn't realize then just how much those words would come to mean. Not even a year later, I lost them both. Grandpa passed first. Sudden, brutal, a heart attack in his favorite recliner. Grandma followed barely a month after, like her heart just couldn't figure out how to keep beating without him. I barely remember the funerals, just a crushing wave of grief that didn't seem to have a bottom. The house by the lake sat silent and empty, like a story waiting for someone to finish it. And then came the reading of the will. I walked into the lawyer's office expecting nothing, maybe a dusty photo album or a stack of old letters. Instead, Mr. Bennett, their longtime attorney, cleared his throat and said, "To our beloved granddaughter Claire, we leave our cottage at 218 Willow Bend Road, along with a financial gift of $150. Oh, whoa. For a second, I thought I misheard. Across the table, I saw my mom's lips press into a furious line. Dad's face turned an ugly shade of red. Sabrina? She looked like she'd just bitten into a lemon. Mister, Bennett continued, unfazed. To our daughter, Margaret, and granddaughter, Sabrina, we leave our love and the memory of the support we have already given. Translation, you got your share. Now sit down. The room exploded. Mom demanding a recount. Dad threatening legal action. Sabrina sniffling dramatically into a tissue like she was the victim. I sat there in stunned silence, clutching the envelope in my lap like it was a life raft. They didn't just leave me a house and some money. They left me freedom. They left me a chance to build a life that was mine. And for the first time in a long, long while, I realized something. I didn't need to keep begging to be chosen. I'd already been chosen by the only people who ever really mattered. I walked out of that lawyer's office clutching the documents like they might vanish if I blinked too hard. The summer air felt heavier than usual, thick with everything I wasn't saying. Behind me, I heard my mom's voice rise into a furious pitch, but I didn't turn around. I didn't owe them anything, not anymore. When I slid into my beat-up Honda, my hands were still shaking. I sat there for a long minute, staring out at nothing, letting it sink in. They chose me. Not because I was the best, or the brightest, or the easiest to love, but because they loved me anyway. No conditions, no comparisons. Just me. It felt both terrifying and exhilarating. By the time I started the car, something inside me had shifted. Something permanent. 2 days later, the calls started. First, it was Mom, all sugary sweet. Claire, honey, can we talk? I ignored it. Then Dad, gruff and impatient. You need to be reasonable. Then Sabrina, leaving tearful voicemails about how much the house meant to her childhood memories. As if I hadn't spent every holiday cleaning up after her parties while she played princess. I didn't answer any of them. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I needed space to think, to breathe, to decide what I wanted without their voices in my head drowning out my own. By the end of the week, they switched tactics. Instead of begging, they started showing up. First, it was Dad, standing awkwardly in front of my tiny apartment door with a grocery bag of cheap wine and store-brand cookies like some peace offering. I didn't open the door. I watched him from the peephole, arms sagging, eventually giving up. Then Mom cornered me at my part-time job, smiling like a politician and pretending she just happened to be shopping nearby. Claire, she chirped too brightly, let's have lunch, just the two of us. We can reminisce. I stared at her, wondering if she even remembered the last lunch we'd had years ago when she spent the whole time texting Sabrina about cake flavors. I shook my head once and turned back inside without a word. It wasn't about the house. It never had been. It was about control. They didn't want me to have something they couldn't touch. They didn't know how to handle the idea of me standing on ground they couldn't yank out from under me. When guilt didn't work, they tried fear. That house is a money pit, Dad warned in a message. Maintenance, taxes you're in over your head. It would be smarter to sell, Mom said in another, her tone just a little too casual. You're not ready for the responsibility. Sabrina added, you could use the cash to finally move into a decent place. It's just a house, Claire. Memories don't pay bills. For a minute, they almost got to me. Almost. The house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was a place built with hands that had never once tried to shape me into something I wasn't. I remembered Grandpa whistling tunelessly as he fixed the front steps, Grandma humming while she folded laundry, the two of them dancing slow and silly in the kitchen when they thought no one was watching. That house was love made solid. I wasn't about to trade it for a handful of cash and a pat on the head. I knew it was going to be hard. I just didn't realize how low they'd go. The first real blow came a few weeks later. I got a call from the city. Some anonymous complaint had been filed about the property claims of neglect, safety violations, threats of fines. I knew exactly who was behind it. The house wasn't even in bad shape. It just needed a little love, some paint, a few repairs. Nothing worth threatening legal action over. Furious, I scheduled an inspection, passed with flying colors, and had the paperwork to prove it. When I sent copies to my parents and Sabrina with a single line, "Niece, try," the silence that followed was almost satisfying. Almost. That's when I realized this wasn't going to fade quietly. If they couldn't shame me, they would try to sabotage me. But I wasn't that scared little kid anymore, desperate for scraps of affection. I was Claire Donovan, the granddaughter of two people who taught me that my worth wasn't up for debate. I started spending weekends at the cottage, cleaning, fixing, restoring. I ripped up the old carpet and found beautiful hardwood underneath. I scrubbed decades of grime from the kitchen tiles until they gleamed. I patched the cracks in the porch and repainted the front door a soft, welcoming blue. Every nail hammered, every brush stroke, every sore muscle, it wasn't just fixing a house. It was fixing me. Every moment I spent there, I could feel my grandparents around me. Their laughter in the creak of the floorboards. Their love in the sunshine that spilled across the worn kitchen counters. Slowly, painfully, I started to build a new kind of life. One where I didn't need to ask permission to exist. But they weren't done, not by a long shot. About a month later, while I was elbow deep in a battle with the ancient plumbing, I got a notice. My parents were suing me. They were contesting the will, claiming undue influence, emotional manipulation, and mental incompetence. According to their lawyer, I had coerced my grandparents into leaving me the house and money. I sat there on the dusty floor, a wrench still in my hand, staring at the papers like they might burst into flames from sheer audacity. They couldn't stand the idea that I had something they couldn't touch. They would rather burn everything to the ground than admit they had lost. I called Mr. Bennett immediately. He wasn't surprised. "We'll fight this," he said calmly. "They don't have a case." The will was prepared with all proper procedures. Your grandparents' wishes were clear. Still, the idea of dragging it all into court made my stomach churn. It wasn't about the house anymore. It was about standing up to them publicly, letting the world see the ugliness they had always hidden behind polite smiles and pretty lies. The day we filed the countersuit, I drove to the cottage and sat on the dock, legs dangling over the water, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold and crimson. I thought about everything it would cost me. The time, the money, the emotional toll. But then I thought about something Grandpa once said when I was about 8 years old, crying over some playground drama. "Claire Bear," he said, patting my head, "some battles aren't about winning. They're about making it clear that you're not someone who can be walked over." I smiled through the lump in my throat. It was never about revenge, it was about respect, about finally choosing myself. The lawsuit would be ugly. The fallout would be worse. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't scared. I was ready. And deep down, I knew something they didn't. I had already won the moment I stopped needing their approval. The day the first court hearing rolled around, I stood outside the courthouse gripping a battered leather folder like it was armor. Inside it were every letter, every birthday card, every photo I had with my grandparents, little pieces of proof that love had never been a transaction between us. It was early fall, and the air smelled like wet leaves and cold stone, sharp enough to sting. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and walked in. I wasn't there to start a war. I was there to tell the truth, even if no one else liked how it sounded. Inside the courtroom, the tension was a living thing. My parents sat stiff, backed on one side, dressed to impress. Sabrina nestled between them like a loyal little foot soldier. Across from them, it was just me and Mr. Bennett, who looked calm as ever, tapping a pen against his notebook in a slow, steady rhythm. Mom avoided looking at me. Dad shot me one glance, cold and flat. Sabrina tried a weak smile that died before it reached her eyes. I sat down without acknowledging any of them. Whatever had once tied us together had already rotted away long before today. Their lawyer started strong, painting a picture of me as a manipulative granddaughter who had isolated the elderly and brainwashed them for financial gain. I sat there listening as he described a version of me that didn't even feel human, greedy, selfish, deceptive. It was almost impressive, the fiction they'd spun. But when it was our turn, Mr. Bennett stood slowly, cleared his throat, and dismantled it piece by piece. He produced dated letters from my grandparents expressing their wishes years before they ever drafted the will. He showed receipts for the times they had financially supported my parents, far more than the so-called emergency wedding funds. He even had testimony from my grandparents' neighbors, who remembered seeing them hosting me for holidays encouraging my studies, cheering on my art. But the real blow came when Mr. Bennett produced a video. It was a grainy recording, nothing special at first glance. Just Grandpa sitting on the porch swing, Grandma beside him, both smiling under the lazy sway of a summer afternoon. In the video, Grandpa said clearly, "We're leaving everything to Claire. She's the only one who ever cared to visit without asking for something. It's what we want, no regrets." Grandma nodded in full agreement, her hand wrapped tightly around his. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint hum of the old video's audio. I watched my mother's face crumple slowly, her hands nodding in her lap. Dad stared straight ahead, frozen. Sabrina looked like she might cry, but I didn't feel sorry for any of them. When the judge called for a recess, I stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air, feeling lighter than I had in months. I leaned against the cold stone wall of the building and tilted my head back, letting the sunlight spill across my face. For once, I didn't care who was watching. I didn't care if they were whispering or judging. I had nothing to be ashamed of. When court reconvened, my parents' case crumbled quickly. Their own contradictions under questioning didn't help. Their lawyer tried to salvage something, anything, but it was clear the judge had seen through the charade. 2 weeks later, the judgment came down. The will was upheld. I retained full ownership of the house and the financial assets. The case was dismissed with prejudice, meaning they couldn't file again. It was over. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I just felt tired. Winning hadn't given me back the people I lost. It hadn't erased the years of feeling invisible, unwanted. But it gave me something else, something I hadn't even realized I needed. Closure. After the ruling, my phone exploded with messages. Some were apologies, half-hearted and dripping with self-pity. Others were full of anger. Accusations that I had ruined the family. I deleted them all without reading past the first lines. Then came the letters. Handwritten notes shoved under my door, tear-stained and frantic. Mom begging to meet, Dad demanding explanations. Sabrina pretending she just wanted to talk like sisters. I threw them all away. Some things, once broken, couldn't be glued back together with apologies made too late. I spent the next few weeks throwing myself into the house, painting walls, fixing leaky faucets, restoring the old garden that had gone wild with neglect. It wasn't just renovation, it was resurrection. Every repaired corner, every new coat of paint felt like reclaiming a little more of my future. Friends started visiting. They marveled at the place's charm, the peaceful air, the way the sunset hit the water just right. Slowly, it stopped feeling like a memorial. It started feeling like a beginning. Of course, my parents didn't give up that easily. If they couldn't win in court, they'd try winning in public. They took to social media, painting themselves as heartbroken parents abandoned by an ungrateful daughter. I ignored it. Neighbors told me they'd heard wild stories. Everything from me being a scam artist to me joining some kind of cult. I laughed the first time I heard that one. Let them talk. Let them spin whatever tales they needed to feel better about themselves. I didn't owe them silence to protect their lies anymore. One evening, as I sat on the newly rebuilt front porch sipping tea, I got a message that caught me off guard. It was from my Aunt Nora, my mother's estranged younger sister. We hadn't spoken in years. "Claire," she wrote, "I heard what happened. Just wanted you to know, not everyone believes the garbage they're spreading. If you ever want to grab coffee, I'd love to catch up." I stared at the message for a long time, the cup cooling in my hands. Aunt Nora had always been the family rebel, the one who refused to play along with Mom's perfect family facade. Maybe it was time to reach out. Maybe not everyone tied to my bloodline was a lost cause. I met Aunt Nora 2 days later at a little cafe by the river. She looked older, a little tired, but when she smiled and hugged me, it felt genuine. We talked for hours about Grandma and Grandpa, about the past, about how hard it is to walk away from people who are supposed to love you but don't know how. She told me she admired me, said she wished she had been brave enough to cut ties years earlier. I didn't know what to say. I didn't feel brave most days. Mostly I just felt stubborn, but hearing it from someone who had lived it meant more than I could explain. As fall turned to winter, life settled into a new rhythm. I started picking up freelance art gigs, small commissions that turned into bigger ones. I turned one of the upstairs bedrooms into a studio, sunlight flooding through the big old windows onto blank canvases and fresh ideas. Slowly but surely, I was building something real, something mine. Sometimes, late at night, I still felt the old ache, the hollow place where family should have been. But it didn't hurt the way it used to. It was quieter now, less a bleeding wound, more a faded scar. I thought about my grandparents often. When the snow dusted the roof like powdered sugar, when the lake froze into glass, when the garden slept beneath a blanket of frost. I hoped they would have been proud. Not because I won a court case, not because I held on to the house, but because I finally believed the thing they tried to tell me my whole life. That I was enough just as I was. The funny thing about letting go is that it feels like falling at first. Terrifying, empty, endless. But somewhere along the way, you realize you aren't falling at all. You're flying. And I had finally found my wings. Life has a funny way of testing you right when you start thinking you've got it all figured out. For the first time in what felt like forever, things were steady. My freelance work picked up faster than I expected. People liked my art, and not just the polite "that's nice" compliments I grew up pretending to believe, but real, paying commissions. I wasn't rolling in cash, but for the first time I wasn't drowning either. I started hosting small art classes at the lakehouse on weekends. A handful of kids from town who needed somewhere warm and safe to paint and dream. It made the place feel alive again, like the spirit of my grandparents was still dancing through the halls, laughing with every streak of color smeared across the old wooden floors. Aunt Nora became a regular part of my life, too. She'd stop by with coffee, help me haul heavy canvases upstairs, swap stories about growing up in a family where love was something you had to earn like a prize instead of a given right. For months, I let my guard down around her. I wanted to believe blood didn't always have to equal betrayal. She was proof of that, or so I thought. It started small, little things. A missing set of antique silverware that I shrugged off as misplaced. A check from a client that took weeks longer to arrive than expected. Strange charges popping up on my business account, things I never bought. I blamed myself at first. Maybe I was disorganized. Maybe I wasn't as ready to run my own life as I thought. But the gnawing feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. One afternoon, while sorting receipts for tax season, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A series of payments, small enough to escape notice, all made to an account under a name I recognized too well, Nora Donovan. I sat there staring at the numbers, my heart hammering so loud I could hear it echo in my ears. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't an accident. Aunt Nora had been siphoning money from my business account for months, while she smiled over coffee, while she praised my resilience, while she told me she was proud of me. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there in the empty kitchen, the late afternoon sun casting long, crooked shadows across the floor, and let the betrayal settle into my bones like ice. I thought about confronting her immediately, marching over to her house, waving the evidence in her face, demanding answers, but another voice whispered in the back of my mind, calmer, colder, don't react, plan. I knew better than anyone that emotion was a weapon people like her could turn against you. I wasn't going to give her that chance. Instead, I gathered everything, bank statements, transaction histories, screenshots. I called Mr. Bennett, my voice steady even as my hands shook. He listened quietly, then said in that calm, infuriatingly rational voice of his, "Claire, you know what you have to do." And I did. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the money, though heaven knew I couldn't afford to lose a single dime. It was about sending a message, not just to her, but to myself. I wasn't the little girl who let herself be pushed aside anymore. I wasn't the scared teenager too afraid to stand up and demand to be seen. I filed a police report, quietly, without fanfare, without drama. When the officers came to ask questions, I answered them calmly. I showed them the evidence. I handed over everything without apology or hesitation. The day they came to arrest her, I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. I was at the lakehouse, sanding down an old bookshelf I found in the attic, imagining how good it would look in the studio when I finished. My phone buzzed once with a message from Mr. Bennett. It's done. I turned off my phone, set down the sander, and sat by the window watching the snow fall in slow, lazy spirals. A week later, a letter arrived, handwritten, messy, desperate. Aunt Nora begging for forgiveness, blaming financial stress, loneliness, anything she could think of. She didn't deny it. She didn't even try. She just pleaded. I read it once, folded it neatly, and put it in the bottom drawer of my desk without replying. Some things didn't deserve an answer. Word spread fast in town. Small towns are like that. Whispers traveled faster than any wildfire. Some people looked at me differently when I passed by, some with pity, some with judgment, but I didn't care. I had nothing to be ashamed of. I protected myself. I protected the home my grandparents entrusted to me. And if people didn't like the way I did it, they were welcome to look away. Winter deepened, the lake froze solid, and the world outside grew sharp and brittle. Inside the cottage, though, life pulsed on. Kids still came for art classes, their boots dripping melted snow on the old floors. The fire crackled in the hearth every evening. The smell of coffee and paint and old wood filled every corner. Slowly, the betrayal started to lose its grip on me. It didn't vanish. Scars don't disappear. They just become part of the map you carry, reminding you of the places you've been and the things you've survived. Sometimes, when the house was quiet, I thought about what my grandparents would say if they could see me now. I like to imagine Grandpa clapping me on the back, gruff and proud. Grandma slipping a fresh cookie into my hand when she thought no one was looking. I miss them every day. I miss the easy way they loved me, the way they made the world feel just a little less sharp around the edges. But I also knew they hadn't really left. They lived in the laugh lines forming around my mouth from smiling too much, in the paint smudges on my hands after a long day of creating, in the heavy, fierce beat of my heart that refused to be broken no matter how many times someone tried. By the time spring thawed the last of the ice from the lake, I was different, stronger, sharper, quieter maybe, but in a way that felt powerful, not afraid. I had lost more than I ever thought I could survive. I had been betrayed in ways that still made my chest ache if I thought about them too long. But I was still here, still building, still choosing myself over and over again. That was the thing they never understood. Love wasn't about possession. Family wasn't about blood. Home wasn't a place you inherited by birthright. It was something you fought for, something you built with your own two hands, something you protected even when it hurt. The day the garden finally bloomed again, I stood barefoot in the cool dirt, hands on my hips, surveying the explosion of color around me. Wildflowers and tulips and stubborn little daffodils waving in the breeze, like they owned the whole world. I laughed, a deep, rich sound that startled even me. And for the first time in what felt like years, the sound wasn't tinged with bitterness. It was just joy, pure, sharp, undeniable joy. Maybe life would always be messy. Maybe people would always find new ways to disappoint me. But here, in this moment, with the sun warm on my face and the lake glittering like 1,000 tiny mirrors in the distance, none of that mattered. I was home, and no one could take that away from me again. The morning everything changed, started like any other. I was standing at the kitchen counter, barefoot, sipping lukewarm coffee out of a chipped mug I hadn't had the heart to replace, watching the sun stretch lazy fingers across the lake. It was peaceful in that bone-deep way you only get when you fought like hell to protect your peace. I had just finished prepping supplies for the weekend art class when my phone buzzed on the counter, an email notification lighting up the screen. I almost ignored it. Most emails were spam or invoice confirmations these days, nothing that couldn't wait. But something about the subject line made me pause. Invitation to exhibit at Willowbrook Art Collective. I stared at it for a full minute before setting my coffee down and opening the message. It was from a woman named Elise Tran, the director of a small but prestigious gallery 2 towns over. She had seen my work through an online portfolio a former client shared, and they were preparing a new exhibit highlighting emerging artists from the region. She wanted me to submit 3 pieces for consideration. 3 pieces, 3 chances to show the world something I had built with my own hands, something that wasn't for grades or approval or survival. Something just for me. My heart thudded against my ribs, loud enough I was sure the neighbors could hear it. For a second I doubted. That old voice, the one that had been carefully stitched into my brain by years of being overlooked and underestimated, whispered that it was a mistake, that I didn't belong anywhere near a real gallery. But I shut it down before it could gather speed. Not this time. I wasn't that girl anymore. I spent the next 2 weeks pouring every ounce of myself into the paintings. I lost track of time, forgetting to eat, ignoring texts, waking up in the middle of the night with some idea I had to scribble down before it vanished. It wasn't easy, it wasn't smooth, but it was real. When I finally stepped back and looked at the finished pieces lined up against the studio wall, something inside me cracked open. These weren't just paintings. They were pieces of every broken, stubborn, beautiful thing that had carried me through the worst years of my life. When I delivered the paintings to the gallery, Elise greeted me warmly. She was younger than I expected, dressed in jeans and a rumpled sweater, her hair pulled into a messy bun. She walked me through the airy, sunlit space, pointing out the spots where each artist's work would hang. When she stopped in front of a blank section of wall reserved for me, she smiled and said, "You belong here, Claire. I'm really glad you said yes." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, fighting the ridiculous sting of tears behind my eyes. I had spent so long convincing myself that no one outside my grandparents could ever really see me. Maybe I had been wrong. Opening night arrived faster than I was ready for. I wore a simple navy dress and sensible flats, my heart hammering against my ribs with every step toward the gallery doors. Elise greeted me with a hug and a glass of sparkling cider, steering me toward the small crowd already milling through the exhibit. People were stopping in front of my paintings, talking, smiling, pointing out details. I hovered awkwardly at the edges at first, terrified someone would recognize me and laugh, until I caught a snippet of conversation from an older woman in a bright scarf. "This one," she said, pointing to my piece of the lake at sunset. "It feels like home." Something inside me loosened. Just a little, just enough. The night blurred into a soft haze of handshakes and compliments and tentative conversations. Elise introduced me to a few local gallery owners, a couple of buyers, even a magazine columnist who said she might want to feature my work in an upcoming issue. I should have been floating, and part of me was. But underneath it all, a knot of uncertainty kept twisting tighter, because with every opportunity came a question I hadn't let myself ask before. Was I ready to leave the cottage behind? Elise pulled me aside near the end of the evening, her voice low and excited. "Claire, I have to ask," she said, handing me a business card from one of the gallery owners. "Have you ever thought about moving to Willowbrook? The art scene here is growing fast. You could teach classes, sell more work, build something bigger." That word echoed through my chest, rattling the careful walls I had built around myself. Bigger meant risk. Bigger meant leaving the one place that had ever felt safe. I drove home that night with the radio off, the only sounds the crunch of tires on gravel and the low hum of my thoughts swirling. The cottage loomed ahead, warm light spilling from the windows, the porch swing creaking in the breeze like a welcome. I parked but didn't get out, just sat there gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. Could I really leave this behind? Wasn't this what I had fought for, clawed for, survived for? But deep down, a quieter voice whispered that maybe the fight wasn't just about keeping the past safe. Maybe it was about trusting myself enough to build a future worth living in. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the front steps, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the stars wheel overhead, the lake whispering secrets in the dark. I thought about my grandparents, about everything they had poured into me, about the life they would have wanted for me. They didn't save me so I could spend the rest of my days clinging to what was safe. They loved me enough to believe I could fly. The next morning, I made a list. I'm a list person when I'm scared. Pros and cons, neat little columns that try to pin chaos into something manageable. Staying meant security, familiarity, the house, the memories. Leaving meant risk, struggle, change. But it also meant growth, opportunity, maybe even happiness. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the list until the sun rose high enough to cast long beams across the floorboards. Then I flipped the paper over and wrote one question in the center. Which choice would make you proud of yourself 10 years from now? The answer wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. It wasn't comfortable. But it was clear. I called Elise that afternoon, my voice shaking but certain. "I'm in," I said simply. "I'm ready to start something new." She laughed, delighted, and promised to help me find a studio space, introduce me to people who could help get me settled. I hung up the phone, leaned against the counter, and let out a long, shaky breath. Fear and excitement danced wild in my chest, two sides of the same coin. I wasn't running away from the cottage. I was carrying it with me. Every creaky floorboard, every warm sunbeam, every whispered encouragement stitched into my bones. The next few weeks were a blur of packing and planning and goodbye visits. I kept a few essentials: a worn armchair Grandpa loved, a chipped mug from Grandma's kitchen, my favorite quilt, the framed photo of the three of us smiling at the lake's edge. Everything else I carefully sorted, donated, or packed into storage. I decided not to sell the cottage. I couldn't bear the thought. Instead, I arranged for a local caretaker to keep it up, renting it out seasonally to families looking for a quiet escape. It felt right. It kept the house alive, filled it with new laughter and new memories without erasing the old ones. The day I locked the door for the last time as a full-time resident, I didn't cry. I stood on the porch, hand resting on the warm wood of the door, and whispered a simple thank you. For the love, for the shelter, for the strength. Then I turned, keys jangling softly in my pocket, and walked down the path toward a future I was finally ready to claim. Moving to Willowbrook felt like stepping into a story I didn't quite believe belonged to me at first. The town was bigger than the one I left behind, but small enough that faces became familiar after a few weeks. Brick sidewalks wound past cozy coffee shops and art supply stores with dusty windows and handwritten signs, and on Saturdays a farmer's market popped up by the river, filling the air with the scent of fresh bread and lavender. It didn't feel like starting over. It felt like stepping into the life I should have been living all along. Elise introduced me to the right people, just like she promised. I rented a small studio above an old bookstore, sunlight spilling through wide windows onto unfinished canvases and half-drunk cups of coffee. I taught weekend workshops, helped organize local exhibitions, even sold my first painting for more money than I had dared to dream was possible. Slowly, the fear that used to coil in my gut whenever something good happened started to loosen. I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop anymore. I was planting new roots in soil that finally welcomed me. The gallery show led to others. A small article about my work ran in the regional arts magazine. Invitations trickled in, each one a reminder that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't an imposter after all. I made friends, real ones, people who didn't know anything about my messy past and didn't care. They saw the person I had become, not the one I had spent so many years trying not to be. And somewhere along the way, I realized something simple but revolutionary. I didn't have to keep proving myself worthy of love. I already was. Still, no matter how busy life became, the lake house never left me. Every spare weekend, I found myself driving back. The minute I turned onto the gravel path and the trees closed in overhead, it was like exhaling after holding my breath too long. I'd unlock the door, step into the warm hush of memory, and feel them there with me. Grandpa humming as he fiddled with a stubborn doorknob. Grandma calling me in from the porch for hot cocoa. Those moments weren't ghosts. They were stitched into the walls, the floors, the very air. The first summer after I moved, I decided to host a retreat at the cottage. A small group of artists. A few days of painting, talking, sitting by the fire as the stars stitched patterns overhead. It felt right, like the house was still living, still giving. When I sent out invitations, I didn't expect much, but every slot filled within days. Some people drove from nearby towns, some flew across states. Strangers who became something more over the course of a weekend, spent chasing sunsets and swapping stories. It wasn't loud or fancy, it was honest. And it made me realize something else too. Healing doesn't always look like forgetting the pain. Sometimes it looks like turning the pain into something beautiful, something bigger than yourself. It looks like standing barefoot on the porch while strangers laugh and paint and build memories of their own, and knowing you helped make it possible. It looks like reclaiming every piece of the life you were once convinced you didn't deserve. One evening, after the last guest had gone, I sat alone by the water, toes skimming the cool surface, watching the sky melt from gold to violet. The lake was perfectly still, the trees whispering secrets only they understood. I pulled the old quilt tighter around my shoulders and let the peace seep into my bones. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who sat alone at family dinners, invisible and aching. I thought about the woman I had become, the one who built a life from broken pieces and dared to call it beautiful. And I realized with a quiet, steady certainty that I wouldn't change a single thing. Every hurt, every betrayal, every lonely night had led me here, to this moment, to this fierce, stubborn joy I had carved out for myself. A soft rustling behind me made me turn. Elise walked down the path from the house, 2 mugs in her hands, steam curling into the cool night air. She handed one to me and dropped onto the dock beside me with a groan. "Remind me next time not to let you talk me into leading a midnight sketch session," she teased, nudging me gently. I laughed, the sound low and warm, and we sat there in companionable silence for a long while, sipping coffee and watching the stars prick holes in the night sky. Eventually, Elise spoke, her voice soft. "You know, Claire, not everyone would have come out the other side the way you did." I shrugged, suddenly shy. I didn't have much of a choice. She shook her head firmly. "You always had a choice. You just kept choosing yourself. That's what makes the difference." I didn't answer. I just let her words settle inside me like a small, steady flame. The seasons rolled by, each one carrying its own quiet triumphs. New exhibits, new students, new friends woven into the fabric of my life. The house by the lake remained my anchor, the place I returned to whenever the noise of the world got too loud. It was never about the money or the property. It was about the love stitched into every creaky floorboard, every faded curtain, every sun-warmed windowsill. It was about carrying that love forward, into every choice I made, every risk I took, every life I touched along the way. Years later, standing in my own gallery in Willowbrook, surrounded by paintings that bore the fingerprints of every lesson, every scar, every stubborn victory, I caught sight of a little girl wandering shyly through the door with her mother. She paused in front of a painting of the lakehouse at dusk, her small face solemn and curious. I crouched down to her level and asked if she liked it. She nodded, her hand drifting toward the canvas without touching it. "It looks like magic," she whispered. I smiled, feeling something inside me settle with a final quiet click. "It is," I said. "It really, really is." Story 2, I ought not to have taken the call. One afternoon, it took place in the silent workplace. I was examining the housekeeping plan for the upcoming week while seated at my desk. In front of the screen of the company management program, I wrinkled my brows a little when I saw a disparity in the data. My phone started to vibrate at that point. The screen displayed the name of the mother-in-law. I paused for a second. My mother-in-law has been calling a lot lately, usually with complaints, displeasure, or subtle commands. To be honest, it made my chest tense, but I hit the answer button out of habit because it was the 3rd call. "Hi, Mom." No response was received. Rather, I heard background sounds, like someone pulling a chair. Then there was the sound of a cup being set down. Isn't she blatantly shameless? It was definitely her voice. Despite having barely completed high school, she pretends like she owns her own cleaning business and goes about calling it that. Who would even bother with someone like her if it weren't for my son? I held my breath intentionally out of jealousy. I wished her voice went on, yet I wanted it to be a misunderstanding. Initial impression. Services. What a farce. Our son is so much better than her. Then, with a strong voice, my father-in-law joined in. To be honest, I've always believed that she was only trying to bring our son down. With that woman, we were far too forgiving. The screen before me became hazy. My eyesight faltered and my heart thumped. In actuality, she is only taking advantage of him, even if she says things like "thank you." She will ultimately make a mistake. Simply wait. I went cold. I'm still holding my phone. Even if I felt like talking, I had a plugged throat. The voice of my mother-in-law went on. "Furthermore, that girl's past isn't really noteworthy. She's not cleaning with her own hands, really. She is only giving the company her name." Scoffing through his nose is my father-in-law's expression. We could have had a far more tranquil existence if our son had not wed that woman. A deep throb began to go through my skull. My hands and feet were freezing, but my ears were burning. I was unable to hang up, though. It was no longer a phone call. I had the impression that I was being pushed to learn the truth. It's okay if she recognizes her station and discreetly backs him. She's been a little too proud of herself recently, too. Later on, such type of stuff inevitably leads to problems. That's right, she ought to be appreciative of being able to live off our son's income. The opposite end of the exchange utterly denigrated me. I didn't need them to say my name, yet they never did. The most painful thing was that I knew precisely who they were referring to. All of my actions had been in vain. I believed I had been silently helping out the family. I wanted nothing in exchange. However, they have viewed me as nothing more than an annoyance. Unexpectedly, tears came. I wasn't even sure if it was out of grief, emptiness, or irritation. However, I did comprehend one thing. I had always been despised by them. A shiver went down my spine as soon as I recognized it, and I could feel something inside of me begin to crumble. I believe that's when I started to transform. For long after I hung up, I was immobile. It wasn't despair or rage. Something heavier and colder crept stealthily into my chest. Without giving it any thought, I got up, made coffee, and went back to my work. I clicked on a folder after opening my laptop. Services for First Impressions. The cleaning firm was called that. A few years ago, I ran. Through a subsidiary, I had also established a real estate management and investment business. In reality, I used my business to pay the mortgage that my mother-in-law and father-in-law thought they were making to the bank. 6 years ago was when it all started. The bank had issued a formal foreclosure warning through the court at the time, since my husband's family home had been missing mortgage payments on a regular basis. While my in-laws were in a panic, my father-in-law, who was too proud to seek assistance, maintained that I would sooner die than be dependent on my son or his wife. However, my hubby was in dire need. The only person I can ask is you. Listen, my parents' house will actually be taken away if things continue this way. There's nothing you need to tell them. Just assist in temporarily repaying the debt. I paused when he said it. However, I nodded when I met his gaze, because I thought that this was what it meant to safeguard family members under the banner of First Impression Services, my business. The whole amount of my in-law's mortgage was purchased by me. At first glance, it appeared that the loan payments had only been moved from the bank to another financial organization. Even now, my in-laws continue to believe that they are sending money to the bank every month, as the payment slips show. In actuality, however, the money goes straight into my account and the invoices originate from my business. I get by. I am now the only legal owner of the residence. Naturally, the original promise was that the assistance would only be temporary for a few months, but things didn't work out that way. I'll pay it back once things calm down, my spouse had replied. However, he never mentioned it again in the 6 years that followed. My in-laws were no different. It had somehow become something that never happened in their imaginations. Totally oblivious to what I had done and what I was carrying, they kept living in that place. They also referred to me as a high school graduate today. Failure. I gave a little giggle as I glanced at my laptop. It was a chuckle of incredulity, but it was also a summons of sorts. It is indeed wonderful to be ignorant. I had been spending hundreds of dollars each month to keep their house safe. They had never expressed gratitude. At the very least, they had no right to make fun of me, even if I didn't expect them to. The roof over their heads was something I had given them without even realizing it. They declared me a failure despite the fact that I had covertly helped them live their lives. Avoid being absurd. I said the words out in a whisper. Those remarks turned into the switch that started the next phase of my behavior. I had put up with it all up until now, since they were kin. However, I was no longer going to justify myself with that word. I calmly perused several folders, including statements, contracts, property documents, and payments. It was everything there. I owned that house. Just picturing their expressions. It stoked a tiny, cozy fire in the center of my chest. I held my phone when I sat on the sofa in the living room that evening. The name of my spouse came up on the screen. Despite my hesitation, I wanted to speak with him. What I had overheard on that phone call was more than I could tolerate. I had thought my spouse would still be with me, at the very least. That was my belief. The phone rang several times before he answered. "Hi there. What is going on?" Even though his voice sounded a little worn out, it still had a pleasant tone. I paused, took a big breath, and then carefully considered what I wanted to say. "Your mother called me today." It appeared to be an error, and I remained connected at home when I answered the phone. Then I heard your folks conversing. His respiration paused for a second. What did they say? I was referred to as a high school graduate. Failure. They added that a lady like her is in no way deserving of our son. To keep my feelings from leaking out, I made an effort to talk as quietly as possible. I was paying close attention to my own voice to make sure it wasn't shaking. There was a pause, and then he replied, "Well, you know how they've always talked like that," with a little uncomfortable laugh. "What? Don't be bothered by it. They're just elderly folks whining. By it, they mean nothing." I couldn't speak. "Are you complaining? No purpose?" However, you would have known they meant every word if you had heard it. At some point, I'll realize that my cleaning service is merely a show, that without me, you would all be happier. The feelings I had been suppressing suddenly erupted like a shattered dam. However, I was surprised by how uninterested he was in response. Perhaps it's simply their way of expressing worry. They are most likely worried about our future and growing older. I was taken aback. I never thought there would be such a large distance between us. You are aware of my support for them over the years, aren't you? Do you know what I had to do to accomplish that? Naturally. But isn't that a different matter? Right now, my parents aren't attempting to harm you in any way. Silently, something inside me died. As a parent, he had decided to keep them safe. Neither as a wife nor even as an ally was I present. Perhaps I already knew that in my heart. I simply didn't want to acknowledge it, though. I nodded slightly while still staring at my phone. "I understand. Regards." "That's sufficient." "Hold on. No, I didn't mean that. I'm heading to bed. Good night." My heart felt oddly at ease as I hung up. It wasn't rage that grew inside of me. Sorrow. It was something deeper, a kind of resolve. For 6 years, I had protected that house. Supported his parents without a word. Because I trusted my husband. Because I believed he truly cared for me. But the reality was different. No matter how much I gave to his parents, I was just an outsider. And maybe to him, I was just someone convenient. I stood up quietly and headed for the bedroom. My steps were surprisingly light. "It's over." Saying the words out loud brought a strange sense of relief to my chest. That was the moment the word divorce clearly took shape in my mind. The next morning, the moment I woke up, I had already begun to take action. There was no more hesitation. It was time for me to face the reality I had been avoiding. I opened the laptop on my desk and, staring at the screen, tapped one contact, Michael Smith, my financial advisor. He had been with me since the founding of First Impression Services, a reliable person with a strong legal background. After a few rings, his voice came through the speaker. "Joanna, what's going on?" "Kind of an unusual time. Sorry. I have something urgent I need to confirm." "Naturally. Tell me anything." I got straight to the point. The deal from 6 years ago, the one when we bought out the mortgage on my in-laws' house, property number 12. The provision concerning quick transfer of ownership in event of default. Is that still valid? Michael thought for a while, then responded in a quiet, forceful tone. "Absolutely. I lobbied for that clause personally. The moment they failed to pay, First Impression Services with legally gained complete ownership. It is not a choice. It happens instantly, I understand. Regards." The first relieved about it, I silently let out a breath. "What is their present payment status, by the way?" "It's funny you say. That's something I've been considering. In actuality, they have lagged behind over the last half year. Although this month's deadline is the 15th, the balance was getting near. How much is left as of right now?" The balance as of yesterday was approximately $1,200. The $2,800 payment is due next. In all likelihood, they will fail. I gave a quiet nod. According to the terms of the deal, the property will be fully ours if they don't pay by the 15th. That's right. There is no way to back out of the deal unless they pay more than $350,000 in one flat amount. Officially, you will be the rightful owner. Every syllable felt like another piece of armor snapping into place. And even though Michael's voice was calm, I hesitated for a second before continuing. "How likely is it that they will attempt to defend themselves? If they truly understood the contract, they wouldn't have a leg to stand on," Michael said, after giving it some thought. "But they might lash out, complain to the company, and try to damage your reputation. There is no doubt that such an event may occur. Yes, I believe they will attempt it. Don't worry. The contract and substantial evidence support everything. You will win 100% legally. I'll take care of it immediately if something comes up." I was eventually able to unwind a little after hearing his remarks. "Thank you. You have been of great assistance." After the call was cut off, On the screen of my laptop, I opened a folder. All of the paperwork pertaining to my in-laws' home was contained there. The title document and the purchase agreement. Email correspondence with lawyers and payment records. They were all evidence of the work one had done. I am not your typical daughter-in-law. The owner is me. I was taken aback by how natural it sounded when I spoke it aloud. My mother-in-law's comments, high school graduate failure, kept repeating in my head. But that didn't seem like an appraisal to me anymore. It was only the self-introduction of an uninformed individual. I wouldn't let the opinion of others to determine my value. I was able to support myself. I had to let them know precisely where they stood because of this. The deadline for the mortgage was 4 days away. It's likely that my in-laws were still going about their daily lives without realizing what was about to happen. However, I was no longer covered by their insurance. I'll follow my own rules from now on. I silently closed the screen after making that choice. I got a message on my phone that afternoon. What about Sunday night's dinner? Seeing you again would be pleasant. My mother-in-law was the sender. Her communications were usually short, like business notes. But this one was strangely soft. Was it pleasant too? It was the last time Mom had said something like that I could recall. I thought to myself as I read the message several times. It's coming. The deadline for mortgage payments is just 2 days away. It was clear they were having financial difficulties, even if they didn't express it out. I took a while to respond. Rather, I just typed, "I'll come," with a blank expression, and waited until the next morning, Sunday. I drove gently in the evening to my in-laws' residence, on my way now to my home. The front door opened unexpectedly as I got closer, and my mother-in-law grinned as she emerged. "My goodness, you arrived. I am overjoyed." A shiver went down my spine when I saw that smile. Those identical lips had referred to me as a failure only a few days prior. They now grinned as though she had always liked me. With an artificial smile, I returned the gesture. A long time has passed. The table was packed with bread, salad, and roasted chicken that smelled of garlic wine. It was a far fancier spread than normal. She remarked, "I put a lot of effort into making all of your favorite dishes today." After folding his newspaper, my father-in-law turned to face me and grinned broadly. "You look well, I see." "That's encouraging to see." I was given a glass of wine by my mother-in-law. I scarcely ate anything, and I rarely touched anything. This perfectly arranged warmth made it impossible for my stomach to move. My mother-in-law opened her mouth as if she had been waiting for the perfect opportunity once the food had somewhat settled. "Joanna, I wanted to ask you a question regarding anything. It's coming," I pondered. "Indeed? What is it?" "The mortgage payment is a touch tight this month. Would you be able to assist us?" "A tiny bit without exerting any effort?" I cocked my head a bit. "How much are we discussing?" She turned to look at her husband while I paused. "Including the payment for this month. We would greatly benefit from about $1,000. Even though she spoke quietly, I could hear it. The understated tone that suggested assistance was just expected. "Could you please tell me which house you are residing in?" I grinned after swallowing the words. "That sounds challenging. Haven't prices increased recently?" My mother-in-law gave me a hopeful glance. My father-in-law folded his arms, perhaps anticipating my next move. However, I remained silent. I just sipped my wine quietly. With every second that went by, the air became thicker. My father-in-law then spoke. "Aren't you managing a business?" "It's going nicely, according to our son. With everyone's help, it's going all right." "Then you ought to have some space to help the family, don't you?" His eyes became more acute, that certain tone that simultaneously imposed shame and duty on you. "You were accepted into this family. Don't you believe that helping out around the house is just natural?" I chuckled within and joined in. "No, I purchased it, but for the time being, I kept that line hidden." I grinned and inhaled. "I'll give it some thought." My mother-in-law exhaled a breath of calm. "Really?" she responded. "Thank you," but her tone just conveyed satisfaction. The strategy was effective. When she volunteered to help clean up, I got up. "No need," I said. "Simply get out of it and go to the door." The chilly night air touched across my cheek as soon as I walked outside, and oddly, I saw a silent spark start to blaze deep inside my heart. I would not play with them again until the morning of the 15th, after that lackluster effort that evening. I took a big breath and glanced at my phone. The bank account snapshot. They had not made a deposit, and the payment deadline was midnight. I turned on my laptop and signed in to First Impression Services Management System. My in-laws' home, number 12, which I had purchased 6 years prior, was now formally in default. My business had acquired complete possession of it. I printed out the prepared notification subject after opening a folder. Notice of eviction for breach of contract. Reason: failure to make mortgage payments. Grace time: leave within 60 days. I signed the document with shaking fingers and put it in an envelope to be sent. My response to 6 years of silent perseverance was that my phone started vibrating a little after 2:00 p.m. My mother-in-law called. I purposely didn't answer the first 2 calls. I eventually picked up on the third. "Hi there, it's Joanna." There was no hint of her customary grace in the voice on the other end. It was tinged with fear. "What's going on? Hello?" This morning, an unusual letter arrived. Notification of eviction. I assume this is some sort of error. Mother, it's not an error. Silently yet clearly, I answered. First Impression Services now formally owns the entire property because you have fallen behind on your mortgage payments. You will have to sign a monthly rental agreement going forward or leave the home within 60 days. Everything on the other end of the line froze for a second. My father-in-law then arrived. "Go for it. Avoid being absurd. What are you saying? And do you even understand it? Our home is there. The only people who believed that were you." As I spoke, my eyes were fixed on my computer screen. That residence was purchased by me 6 years ago. Legally, the home you've been residing in has long been mine. The voice of my mother-in-law sounded worse. That is untrue. All this time, we had been making bank payments. The loan to the bank was paid back by my firm. From the beginning, First Impression Services has been the beneficiary of your payments. Did you truly not know? Inside, I was giggling. They had denigrated me while they were so naive. Not because they were unaware. It was nearly fulfilling. All of this behind our backs, huh? Indeed, I did. However, I defended that residence for 6 years without receiving any complaints. Neither of you ever expressed gratitude. Keep quiet. From the other side, all I could hear were trembling, irate gasps that mixed perplexity, fear, and wrath. Next came a deep grumble from my father-in-law. "This is not how it will end. We have our own thoughts if you're going to do anything like this. Like, I'll complain to your organization. I'll reveal every detail of your history. You must have made up a lot of stuff, don't you? You won't be able to continue operating your firm if the public finds out." It was there. The danger. However, I no longer felt anything. Is that correct? Feel free. All of the documents and contracts are available. Additionally, you will bear the consequences in the event of a defamation case. His obscenities interrupted me in the middle of my sentence. The phone hung up. I sat back in the chair and set my phone on the table. It was silent, and that calm seemed somehow reassuring. All the tension and dread I formerly carried. Now that the sun had come out, it was gone like mist. Perhaps this was a war after all, one to demonstrate my identity and position. I had made an effort to be the nice daughter-in-law up to this point. I made an effort not to annoy my in-laws. I made an effort not to make my hubby look bad. To fit in, I'm trying to get smaller. But that was the end of it. All I had done was use what I had earned by my own hard work. Nevertheless, the sense of freedom was tremendous. Gazing at the text, property. The whole ownership transfer for number 12 was visible on my computer screen, I whispered. At last, now it's really my home. When I got to work the following morning, my supervisor, Nola, came up to me looking uncomfortable. "Do you have a moment to speak, Joanna?" Something didn't feel right. She flashed me an email on her laptop screen as she led me into a conference room. Joanna K. is an employee who has defrauded her family financially. Our house was taken away from us and we were threatened. Even though the sender was anonymous, it was instantly obvious that it was from my mother-in-law based on the tone and writing style, Nola said in a low voice. "As a business, we must investigate the facts. However, your job and performance evaluations won't be impacted by personal family issues." I gave a quick explanation of the circumstances. The 6-year-old Accord, the notice of eviction, and the mortgage buyout. Nola paid close attention to all that was said. Then she talked intelligibly. "Do not be concerned. You have all the paperwork and followed the right processes. We don't need to question you." A burden was relieved from my chest. I called my husband, or rather, the man who would soon be my ex-husband after I got home. My firm received a fake report from your mother. Were you aware of that? After a little pause, he spoke. They no longer listen to me when I try to stop her. Which side do you support? I've lost any sense of what's right. I simply don't want chaos to occur. I felt as though I had let go of everything when I heard those words. I understand. Let's then carry out the divorce as scheduled. All right. My heart felt strangely at ease after hanging up the phone. I hadn't needed anyone to get me this far. And I'm going to keep using my hands to defend my life from now on. Midweek is okay. A clerk's knock reverberated at the door. I took it open. My in-laws were standing there. The eyes of my mother-in-law were puffy and red. My father-in-law glared at me while standing with his arms crossed. Please, Joanna, can't this be fixed somehow? Her voice faltered. I remained motionless at the doorway. You have 60 days to vacate. It's too harsh. My father-in-law's voice was low. I merely followed the terms of the deal. However, aren't we family? Together, we have experienced a great deal. I answered silently at the word family. I silently sponsored this home for 6 years. However, you exploited me, dubbed me a failure, and even attempted to ruin my business behind my back. Ultimately, my mom-in-law averted her gaze. My father-in-law couldn't find the right words. I'm not seeking retribution. I just no longer have any motivation to continue helping you. The air seemed to freeze for a second. You're a chilly lady. The remarks were spit out by my father-in-law. I gave them a grin. It was you who became chilly initially. Once more, my mother-in-law spoke. Is there any chance we could remain then? If we're paying rent? You will have to sign a formal rental agreement if you are prepared to pay. However, a background check is part of it. A guarantor will also be required. My father-in-law was grinding his teeth, and I could hear it. Avoid being absurd. Do you intend to ruin this family? I gave him my full attention. The people who destroyed it were you. Nothing else could be said. Without saying a word, I put my hand on the door and gently closed it. I felt really free for the first time at that moment. Michael Smith called me the day before the eviction date. Today, they left. The property's keys have been returned, and it is now officially unoccupied. I exhaled deeply as I glanced at my phone. I had given the official notice of eviction 60 days prior. After the first week, my in-laws stopped calling and messaging me altogether. I thought they would attempt something. In the end, they simply departed in silence, with some moving and some retaliating. I had no desire to see the property. Nevertheless, I drove past it on my way home from work a few days later. Even though it was the house I knew so well, it appeared completely different. There were no windows. The yard was overrun with weeds. The speed at which a house devoid of humans might alter the atmosphere surrounding it astounded me. I didn't pull over. I simply passed in silence. I had no remorse or connection. I may be proud of what I had done to get here, but it wasn't anything to brag about. My soon-to-be ex-husband and I were already in the process of getting a divorce. There were no disagreements or requests for payment. It seemed like a romance that was destined to end. I then put even more effort into my job. I started getting ready to open a second location of the cleaning company. There was also an increase in corporate contracts. Without anyone's help, I went forth on my own. However, it didn't feel lonely. I was now in charge of my own life. I realized for the first time what it meant to feel playful. After a while, I received a message on my phone. Can we chat, please? I've lost my sense of where to go. I received it from my mother-in-law. I read the little message several times. I could have been uncomfortable in the past. I may have debated whether or not to respond. Not just now, though. I had already made up my mind, so I erased the message without a second thought. Never turn around. I sold property number 12 shortly after. It sold in a matter of days after I offered it, at a little less than market value. As I glanced over my account's gains, an idea struck me. Could I assist someone start again with this? In light of that, I established a tiny foundation to provide financial help to women who are being taken advantage of by their spouses or family members. In an attempt to raise money for my escape, I termed it The Home. I wanted to help others who, like me, had nowhere to turn and were imprisoned by the word family. I now realize that having a secure location is considerably more crucial than wearing a black tie. I felt like I had at last discovered a home that was truly mine after leaving that house. Shared blood does not create a family. The folks that don't doubt your value are your true family, those that stand by you while you attempt to get back up without interfering. The most important thing is to become your own best buddy. I no longer have to prove myself to anyone. I don't require anyone's blessing. At last, I can confidently tell myself that I've done more than enough. I can now say this because of this. I've at last discovered the meaning of genuine family. I was that family. An unplanned reconnection a few years later resulted in a new relationship that added new vibrancy to my life. I met him by chance at an event for the cleaning business. My booth was directly next to him. He had had to start his firm from scratch, just like me. We only had light talk at first, but when we kept bumping into one another, I eventually started to trust him. I could talk honestly about what I had experienced. I was never judged by him. "That's amazing," he remarked simply and calmly. I felt like I was saved by their words. Finally, we were married. Our hand-in-hand vows were a pledge of a future that would not be overtaken by the past, even if the ceremony was not very elaborate. A year later, when I felt the soft kicks from inside my abdomen, a tiny life started to develop between us. My eyes filled with tears. I thought no one needed me back then. Now, though, I truly wanted to keep someone safe. I clutched our infant's hand tenderly while I watched them sleep at night. The agony of the past gradually vanished under the warmth of that little palm. My house will never be taken away from me again. My heart will never be denied again. Right here. Love is not confined by blood, but established via care trust. This family is genuine. I picked it, and I fostered its future. Yes, I've at last discovered where I really belong.